Finally, the video we have been waiting for all year long.
It's finally happening!
That's right. This is my best books of the year combined with my worst books of the year, all wrapped up into one nice little video. All right, so let's get into these books. First of all, we're gonna start with my best books of the year. I have 13 of them, and then I'm going to do my worst books of the year. I have 6 of them. I have a total of 4 different books that are not science fiction on this list. Don't hate me, I do read other books. These rankings are completely arbitrary, based solely off of my enjoyment, so they may not be your rankings as well, and that's okay. Let's get into my best books of the year. So to start off with these 13 books, I decided that I wasn't going to rank the 2 non-science fiction books. Let's talk about those now. One of the best non-science fiction book I read this year is the book Tomorrow, Tomorrow, Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This is a contemporary book, which is not a genre I read very often. It happened to be a Good Choice Awards book a couple years ago, and it was a book that a book club, namely my mom, got me to read. This book follows 2 nerds who find each other in college and decide that they want to use their skills to create a video game. Throughout the rest of the book, we get to see the ups and downs of their friendship as the success and failures of their video game and their video game company come to fruition. We also get to see how imperfect friendships can still be perfect for 2 people, and we get to see good coping skills for working through problems throughout a lifetime. There are so many interesting aspects to this contemporary story because you're rooting for one person or another in different time periods, and sometimes one person is right and sometimes the other person is right. This book was such an enjoyable, engrossing read, and it's really just all about these 2 friends and what their friendship looks like. I really enjoyed this book, and I felt quite a lot, which isn't easy.
I don't like it.
So I have to say, I really appreciate this one, and I wanted to mention it here. The next non-science fiction book that I read, that is definitely the best fantasy book I read this year, is gonna be Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang. This book was a book that follows a female as she's about to take the mage test. There is only a couple of women who are allowed to take the mage test to enter into the university, and she has been allowed. In the first couple of chapters, we discover that she's passed the test, but her hardships and problems have only just started, and things aren't what she expected. What's really cool about this book is it doesn't really get into academia the way that the premise might suggest. And it doesn't really only just talk about sexism and the difference in the workplace between men and women. Instead, it really goes very deep into talking about biases, into talking about racism and classism, and really talking about how dangerous something as simple as naive, good-intentioned people can really mess things up. This story showed about how things can implode from the inside, and there were so many layers to this story. I really had a good time with it. It also kind of reflected and impacted me because I felt like I really related to this in my own personal career. So I don't know exactly what that means for my career, but what I can say is it made for a fantastic book. While I did like this author's Sword of Kaigen a little bit better, this Blood Over Bright Haven is a very close second. And I don't think I have to convince anybody, but I will be picking up any book that M.L. Wang comes out with. Now that does it for the non-science fiction books that I read this year that belong on the best of list.
I'm spicing things up!
let's talk about the 11 science fiction books that I got to. Coming in at number 11, we have the book Saturn's Children by Charles Stross. In this future, humans have already gone extinct, and our legacy and culture are held up by the android-like robots that we have left behind. And of course, robots can't reproduce, so we get to see essentially personality clones of one particular line of robot down the generations. In this one, we follow Freya, who happens to be a concubine generation, and she is on Venus in trouble, getting sucked into a shady business deal in order to track down her sister. But this is only the gateway drug for bigger plots afoot. As we get deeper and deeper into the story, we start noticing all the twists and turns of who is the bad guy, who's behind the plot, and who is it that we should really blame. This book really got twisty and turny towards the end and was such a fun, enjoyable, engrossing read the further you got in the story. However, it does rank as the lowest best science fiction book I got, because while I enjoyed the commentary about social human society, and I also really enjoyed some of the sense of humor that Charles really displays in this book.
Funny, isn't he funny? Funny guy.
I also know that the intro was kind of a mess. It was all over the place. It had a little bit of misogyny and definitely needed a little bit of loving care from his editor that he didn't get. Now, before I get a whole bunch of comments, I do also want to mention I did read the second in the series, which is Neptune's Brood, but I found it to be not as engrossing and maybe not quite as fun or entertaining as the first book, which I know is an unpopular opinion, but I gotta stick to my guns. Coming in at number 10 is Freedom TM by Daniel Suarez. This is the second book following Daemon, or Demon. And that doesn't just refer to the name of the first book, it's also the name of the computer program that is taking over the world. Now, without spoiling the first book, let me just say that Suarez really ramps up the science and technology in this book while still having those very addictive, very fast-paced action scenes that made this book such an incredible cyber thriller. I thought this book was way better than the first one because it had that perfect balance of science technology with the action thrilling level of pacing, that this was a perfect candy read that I would highly, highly recommend. In case you're worried, this is a finished duology, and it is one that I highly recommend. Coming in at number 9, we have Contact by Carl Sagan. This book is unexpectedly and wildly different than the Jodie Foster movie, you know, the one that I'm talking about. And it's different in a good way. This book really dives deep into things like politics, faith versus science. We also get quite a lot of social commentary and even a little bit of feminism, which is not something that the movie touched with a 10-foot pole. There was a lot more layers and nuance to this particular story, and is one that really stood the test of time. If you haven't read this particular book, this one is well worth your time. It really surprised me. I think this book has something for everyone. Coming in at number 8, we have We're Late, the Sweet Birds Sang by Kate Wilhelm. This one is the winner of the 1977 Hugo and Nebula Award, and boy, does it deserve it. It's a story in 2 parts, maybe 2 sides of the same coin. I would probably describe it as a dystopian. And the story opens in a world where our reproduction is waning, and not just in humans, in animals too. One of the medical researchers named David discovers that cloned creatures still retain their reproductive abilities. And so in the final throes of desperation, humans create clones in large batches, accidentally shaping a communal clone society that natural-born humans aren't welcome in. The second part of this story follows the clone community in the far-flung future through the eyes of Molly and her son Marcus as all of the negatives in that society begin to show up. This story at its heart is an exploration of communal socialism with a little bit of individuality and comparing the two, which one is better. And there is no ultimate answer. In that way, it kind of reminded me of The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin, but I have to say that this story is a little bit less dense. It's a little bit easier to get through, and I really enjoyed some of the aspects of this particular debate that I had never considered. It's also a book that really stands the test of time, and it felt like it could have been written just a few years ago. So if you haven't picked up this book, I would definitely recommend. Now, coming in at number 7 is the book Rubicon by J.S. Hughes. This is a military science fiction, addictive candy read that I just couldn't put down.
Well, I can't stop now.
In it, we follow Sergeant Valero, who is fighting an unwinnable war against aliens who are more advanced than us in almost every way. But humans have developed a new technology to stay at least one step ahead, and that is the ability to take somebody's loaded consciousness and put it into a new body at the time of death. Therefore, they do remember the death, but they also get to come back and fight another day. But Sergeant Valero has died 96 times.
Total noob.
And doesn't know that she has a 97th in her. Right at her breaking point, she ends up getting a transfer to a new team who does things very different, who might be on to human salvation or humans' destruction. Nobody knows. This story was such a fantastic, on the edge of your seat, perfectly paced story that really did remind me a lot of Mickey 7, but maybe a little bit better. This story was such an addictive candy read that had a lot of elements of classic military sci-fi combined with something like Mickey 7 in such a perfectly paced way that it felt fresh. The reason why it's rated a little bit lower, I was able to get a hold of the author of this story who told me that the publisher isn't interested in publishing the second book to this series, and so it will remain a standalone, thus leaving us at an incredible cliffhanger ending that will, sadly, likely never be resolved.
Why must there always be a problem?
So this book has to rank just a little bit lower in my enjoyment scale. Coming in at number 6 is going to be Flickermen by Ted Kosmatica. In this book, we follow a washed-up alcoholic physics researcher who is on the last legs of his grant, and in desperation decides that he wants to see a classic experiment, but accidentally discovers a test for consciousness. With this incredible idea, the story doesn't end. Instead, the majority of the book delves into the incredible public and multi-layered consequences of what a test like this might mean to the world. This book goes through the spectrum of consequences. We get the pro-lifers who are trying to prove when consciousness starts in a fetus. We get the tree huggers and the animal lovers who are trying to prove that other life on Earth also has levels of sentience. And then we also have a 0.05% of the human population who tests negative for consciousness. There's a lot going on in this book, and there's even more consequences than what I've listed here. This book really is an incredible journey that I did not expect. It came out of nowhere. The reason why it's a little bit lower than my top 5 is because the author kind of goes in a really weird direction at the end where I didn't quite get the resolve that I was looking for in the end of this standalone book. However, I still think that the journey was well worth this ending, even though it was a little bit less than satisfying. And this is coming from a really big ending reader, so I don't make that suggestion very lightly. Now, coming in at number 5, we have a classic, and that is The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. This is a military science fiction classic that, to be honest, even if you don't like military science fiction, you should give a chance. This book follows a man through his military career in the future when humanity goes to war against an alien nation. What's really special about this book is all of the critique that this book goes into. It doesn't shy away from showing us the reality of what travel in space and time dilation would really be like, of taking away the romance out of some of the military power armor training, of showing us how lonely it would be to travel the stars and not really get to be a part of any one community. I think the parts of the book that struck me the most in this story, without any spoilers, is being able to experience through the character's eyes how society changes over time. And it's not just that everyone around you has died and everyone you have ever met is centuries long gone. It's that even the society and their values around you have changed into something unrecognizable. And our main character experiences this several times. And it is so disconcerting that I really feel the loneliness and isolation of this main character. There's also a lot of social commentary in this book beyond just the military, including a lot of sexuality and the part that culture plays in sexuality that I think is a really strong, very divisive statement, but one that might bring up some really interesting conversation. So I really have to say that this book really deserves a place on my best of list because of how multi-layered that this book could be. I would probably label it as an onion book based off of how many layers are in this book. Coming in at number 4, we have The Swarm by Frank Schatzing. And if you have listened to any of my other videos, you already know how obsessed I am with this book.
I can't stop thinking about it.
This was my first 5-star of the year, and I still remember parts of this book. It has really stuck with me. And even though it is a chunky monkey of a book, I would still highly recommend it. In case you forgot, this is an eco-thriller book that follows a whale biologist in Alaska, an oil man off the coast of Norway, and a journalist from France. And they all come together as the North Sea shelf falls into the ocean, creating a domino effect, causing one of the biggest worldwide disasters this planet has ever seen. The marine biology, the oceanography, the economics, the info dumps in this book made me learn so much and feel so smart. Plus, the action scenes continue to really take off and peak towards the end of this book to the point where I could not put the last half of this book down. It was such a fun, fulfilling, satisfying read that this is one that I'm not likely to forget anytime soon. And I may not let you forget about it either. So just do yourself a favor. Pick it up. You'll thank me. Coming in at number 3, we have the book Deepness in the Sky by Vernor Vinge. In this book, we have finally done it. We finally found another sentient species, and it's on a lone planet in a solar system with an on-off sun, where for several years we have a normal luminescence, and then for multiple years we have the sun turns off, where it puts out a lot less than normal luminescence, creating really dangerous and hostile environment on the planet. And there are 2 factions of humans that are racing towards this planet, trying to be the first to get to have first contact with these species. However, as the battle rages in their solar system, the oblivious spider-like creatures on the planet are going through a scientific revolution that is threatening to cause a cultural crisis. And we get back and forth points of view throughout this whole book. It was such a fun ride. I have to also admit that I still have 4 chapters left in this book, and I know that's kind of cheating, but unless Vinji really messes this up, I really think this book has a very solid place on this list. I don't think it had quite as many ideas as his other book, Fire Upon the Deep. That one had a lot more ideas in it, but I feel like Deepness in the Sky was a little bit more of a fun read. The beginning kind of reminds me a little bit more of Three Body Problem with the on-off sun, but we also get a very heavy dose of Children of Time with the spider-like creatures on the planet. Now, it's not the same, but to be compared to Children of Time means you're probably doing something right, because I loved that book. Coming in at number 2, we have All You Need Is Kill by Hiroshi Sarazaka. This is another light military science fiction novel where our main character is an undertrained recruit who is told that he has to fight against a much more advanced alien species known as the Mimics. And as he confronts his very first mimic, he dies, only to wake up the very next morning to live the day again. As you can see, we're going to go through several time loops until we get to the point where we meet Rita, who is also known as the Full Metal Bitch.
That's the Full Metal J Squad.
Rita is someone who is helping our main character get out of his time loop and hopefully come up with a way to win the war. Now, in case this story sounds familiar to you, that's because it should be. This is the book that inspired the movie Edge of Tomorrow. Maybe one of the easiest to watch movies of all time. I really loved the movie, but I gotta say the book surprised the crap out of me because the ending is way different than the movie. And I gotta say, the book was a lot more emotional for me. I would highly recommend picking up this book because it's really easy, it's also short, and it was such an emotional ride. Now, just so you guys know, I could just insert my worst books of the year and make you wait for my number 1 best book of the year, but I'm not gonna do that.
Thank you.
Instead, let me go ahead and introduce my number 1, which is the book that when I closed it, I had this moment of this is why I love science fiction.
I love it, I love it, I love it, I love it.
And that book is Darwin's Radio by Greg Bear. This book features Chris, who is a virus hunter who teams up with a molecular biologist to track down a new virus that seems to be infecting only pregnant women, causing a miscarriage. And the symptoms of this virus begin to change over time to some very surprising side effects that begin to be covered up by the government. The deeper we get into this story, the more crazy it becomes until we figure out that maybe this isn't a virus after all. This story was so well paced. It was perfectly mixed with action and mystery and character development, as well as some real full-fledged science and some fun, playful creativity. This book really was my best book of the year because it just had that feeling of this is the reason why I love science fiction. Is it a perfect book? Absolutely not. But is it a book that I'm afraid to read the second one because I don't want to ruin the high of the first one? Absolutely. If you guys know of any other books that you would recommend, be sure to put them down in the comment section below. I really want to hear about your best book this year, especially because I need to read some books next year. And if you're still with us, let's move on to the worst books of the year. Now, I don't enjoy including this category because I don't just want to complain about books, but it is important that you understand my particular tastes and which books don't work for me, so that way you can understand which books that did work for me and decide if you are a reader who has my tastes or not. Luckily, I gotta tell ya, we only have 5 worst books of the year, which is a pretty decent number for me. I really think that it was a pretty good year for the most part, but there's always a few turds in the bucket, if you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
There's always a few books that aren't going to work for me, and that's normal, that's expected, so I'm gonna share a couple of those for you here. Coming in at number 5, we have Forever Free by Joe Haldeman. Yes, that's right. This is the second book to Forever War. This one is still following our main character after the war has ended, and we get to see him return through circumstances back into space. One of the reasons why this sequel became not just a lackluster sequel for me, but also became a worst book of the year is because the resolutions and the ideas that Haldeman tries to tie together in this story really end up being very poorly executed, to the point where I started to enjoy our main character less, and kind of cheapened for me a lot of the cool things that the first book put together. So I really thought that this sequel not only was poorly done, but it made the first book a little bit less. And for me, that's what qualifies as a worst book of the year. So I would highly recommend against reading this one, especially if you enjoyed the first one. Let's just pretend like this book doesn't exist.
Or doesn't exist.
In that same vein, coming in at number 4, we have Children of God by Mary Doria Russell. This is the second book in the series that starts with Sparrow. Now, this was a favorite book of mine. It was a best of the year. The first book was previously, and I was really excited to pick up and follow the rest of the journey for this series. However, it definitely did not deliver. We're still following our Jesuit priest who survived a first contact mission among the stars. And he really struggles with his place in the world, his life's purpose, as well as how does faith and science and first contact all come together and work. He is really struggling at the end of the first book. And we end up kind of seeing him struggle a little bit in this second book, but everything just gets resolved so easily. He just wakes up one day and just sort of chooses to move on. And definitely goes back to the planet. It comes up a couple of times, but the emotional resolution was a lot of lackluster in this book. It just wasn't there for me. I just wasn't convinced that he suffered enough or he was able to get over it enough in a conceivable way. And because he didn't, it ended up cheapening the first book for me a lot, which made me put it as a even worse book of the year. Coming in at number 3, we have Polostan by Neil Stephenson. You guys knew this book was going to be on here. I think that this book really suffered a lot from expectation hangover because I thought it was going to be a science fiction book. I was promised a science fiction book, and yet here we are. It's a historical fiction book that has 0 elements of science fiction in it.
Sounds boring.
We're following a Russian girl during the rise of communism, and she spends a lot of her time in both Russia, the United States, and then goes back to Russia. We are given this history of this main character in a non-linear fashion, and the only way that we know where we are in time in terms of this main character is through which name she's going by, and she has 3 names. So I thought that that was, you know, a very interesting and creative way to put a story together, but at the end of the day, I kept waiting for the other shoe to fall. I was waiting for the hat to drop or the mic to go. I was waiting to find out why we care about this girl. Why are we following her through her life? And at the end of the story, I still didn't feel like I cared. I still was never told why this character was important or who she was.
And I should care because...
Ultimately, I found myself not caring about this story. I really had to drag myself through it. I didn't know why I was reading it, and unfortunately, it really just didn't work for me. Coming in at number 2, we have Womb City by Miss Tomase. This has been touted as the female altered carbon, although I don't think I would go that far. We follow an infertile woman named Neela who has recently been given a new body, and she is going out of her way to do anything and everything she can to have a child. However, a lot of her actions in this story really seem ultimately selfish and making a bunch of poor decisions. So I really didn't understand what exactly that had to do with having a child. There was a lot of just really awful poor decisions whose motivations didn't really satisfy me. I didn't feel like the narrative itself was very cohesive. Ultimately, we even changed complete plot and tone about 70% of the way through, which I really enjoyed, but I do know that you're either gonna love the first part of the book or you're gonna love the last part of the book. You're not gonna like them both because they're so drastically different. And for me, this really did not work. I really found it difficult to read through this story, and while I love her prose and ultimately her idea, I wish she had just settled on one that made a cohesive story and focused on a character whose motivations I could believe. And ultimately, I guess the story just wasn't for me, so this one comes in at number 2. Finally, the worst book that I read this year, which really wasn't that terrible, but it still was the worst book I read, and that's The Wanderer by Fitz Leiber. This book is a book that I picked up because it won the Hugo Award, and I really want to try to get through all of the Hugo Award winners. This story had a really interesting premise, but it too suffered from 2 completely different stories that were mashed together in one book that just don't go together. So at the beginning of the story, we have the interesting premise. This is where we see a new celestial body in the sky that just suddenly appears and is now getting closer and closer to Earth. This is nicknamed The Wanderer, hence the title of the story, and there's a lot of speculation of what's going on in this story in the beginning part, and then as the Wanderer, which becomes a planet, gets closer to us, it starts pulling the moon away from our planet and ultimately consuming the moon. This puts Earth into a bunch of chaos, including causing tsunamis and other kind of environmental disasters. Now, despite the pedantic over-explanation of this book, and maybe too many points of view to show us that Earth is in chaos yet again, we understand. Okay, thank you. I was still really interested in the beginning of this story. I thought he had a lot of very interesting ideas, and then all of a sudden we get kind of an introduction of a totally new main character, sort of, who gets abducted by the creatures of the Wanderer, who turn out to be sexy alien cat ladies.
We fancy Moses.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me!
Who decide because they're bored, they're going to have weird bondage torture sex until they're done. And then they're going to leave.
What the?
And we don't get any rest of the plot. Everybody just leaves, everything is all better, and everyone is happy, and that's the end of the story. And I really just didn't see how the first half of the book had anything at all to do with the second half of the book. It seems like there's a lot of like weird wish fulfillment in this. I was very disturbed by a lot of the second part of the book.
Well, that was disturbing.
And it's almost a little funny if you're not expecting a real story, but I don't know that he did it to be funny, which is one of the problems. I really was left with a lot of like disappointments that this story was a Hugo winner. I mean, really? We must have really been scraping the bottom of the barrel, really. And the final question that I have for Fitz Leiber is...
What were you thinking? What was going on in your mind?
Was he a furry? Because I have questions. I don't want any of those questions answered either, so please don't tell me. But I really didn't have a great time with this book. I was so confused with the tone change and waiting for, you know, this story to go back to the original plot that never happened, that it really was the worst book that I read this year, which luckily isn't that terrible, but it definitely is one that I don't recommend.
Sexy alien cat ladies.
So that does it for my worst books of the year this year. You guys are gonna have to let me know in the comment section down below. How was your reading year? Do you have a best book? Do you have a worst book? I would love to hear about it, as I'm sure everyone else would. Until next year, you guys, have a very happy holidays, and I will see you next year.